Hi, everyone. This is Kohenet Annie Matan. Happy birthday, Annie. I am Kohenet Devorah Grenn, and this is episode 8 of Tending Lilith's Fire.
9. It's episode 9.
Oh my God, it's episode 9. That's
okay.
right.
And we're not perfectionists. You can hear us make mistakes.
And it's perfect because 9 is in the Yoruba Ifa tradition, Oya's number. And that's all about change and transformation, which is at the core of what we do. So thank you for correcting me. And we're going to start out with Annie telling us about her birthday spread that she pulled from the Neviah Oracle.
Yeah. So, I pulled from the at Netivot Wisdom Oracle by Kohenet Pitzira Lesser. And wait, it's at a Netivot Wisdom Oracle. Yes, this is the book that goes with the deck. And there's a spread in there for when you want to pull cards for a specific period of time. So it felt like the right thing for my birthday. And there are 2 at spreads. There's a short one of 3 cards and one with 6 cards. And for the first time, I did the bigger one. So in that particular, there are 3 suits in the deck: Vessel, Offering, and Ally. And this spread intentionally has one, the querent pulling from each of those suits. So it's 1 Vessel, 3 Offerings, and 2 Allies. And the Vessel card that I pulled, I will show you, is this one. It is the Neviah, or prophetess, and the phrase on the card is uncover and expose hidden truths. And I wanted to, I shared this with Devorah because I said, oof, that feels like a heavy vessel. And the invitation for the spread for the Vessel card is the aspect of the divine to embody for this period of time. And I was like, oh, that feels like a big job for a year. And thankfully, Devorah offered me an alternative perspective, and that got us going. And we thought that's where we would start and share from today.
So that's one of our themes, because I think that we are both being called on to uncover and expose hidden truths. And we do that all the time, particularly where it regards the erasure of women throughout history, at least from my perspective. And I think for you, that's part of what you're doing. And talking about women who were never named in sacred texts, for example, or the erasure of women today at corporate meetings or in many other settings, profit or nonprofit organizations, I think. Ideas being stolen, or women not being credited, or just being dismissed, and so on and so on. And so I think those are major foundations of our work, looking at a patriarchal system that affects everything, and runs throughout all our structures, profit, nonprofit, religious organizations, government certainly, and so on. So what might that mean to you from that perspective, Annie, in terms of your work uncovering and exposing hidden truths?
Well, you mentioned Machnot Lev, the community, the Jewish spiritual community that I founded, and that's a lot of what I do there. And I was like, yeah, I guess, because one of the truths that I am always seeking to uncover is that everyone is, so, I lead a Jewish community, and I really like to remind folks that we're all Jewish enough, and one of the core tenets of that community is inclusion, and really making space for everyone who wants to access this experience through this lens, whether some other community would consider them not just Jewish enough, but like legitimate in some way. I think the truth is we're all enough. If your soul calls you to experience the sacred through a particular lens or particular language, and in particular, my particular lens and language is Judaism. So if someone feels called to show up in that space and say, this is for me, then for me, the truth is, that's your truth. I'm here to honor it and support your exploration. So that was one of the things that really rang. And then also, like, the way that I work with liturgy and tradition, to say like women's voices have been here all along. And I feel like that's something that I learned in Kohenet is that we were in hiding, that women were hidden, that our voices were hidden and our stories were hidden and our traditions were hidden. And I learned to uncover and expose women in the text and our perspectives in our traditions.
Mm-hmm.
And also not just women, I would say all of us, whether it's also Pride Month right now. So, shout out to like queer and trans folks and people of other backgrounds who are not Jewish, who are also a part of the story, or who come to, we all come to our paths of the sacred and to the sacred through our own lenses, traditions, ancestors. And I really seek to honor the validity of all those pathways.
Mm-hmm. Two things are occurring to me when you talk about all the pathways. Of course, I'm thinking of people of color and how their stories have been so hidden, and how we so often, as with women in general, don't know that a particular woman or man invented something as major as the heart transplant, the first heart transplant, and various other inventions that we automatically assume were done by old white men, which has certainly not been the case. The other thing that occurs to me is the Shekhinah, what they call the female face of God, she who dwells within. I have started calling her God, simply God, and that's after years though of reframing it in my own mind and shaking up whatever those patterns are, those neurons that automatically picture still, old white man with a beard when I hear the word God in certain contexts. Shekhinah is the female divine, and or the female in deity, and she is not a figure I knew about until about 20 years ago. Right.
Yeah.
And so that is definitely a hidden truth and remains so. It isn't just that I didn't learn about it growing up, although she runs throughout the Talmud and certainly Kabbalistic Jewish mystical teachings. But in current times, for example, there is a saying that when two people are studying Torah, our sacred text in Judaism, it's as if the Shekhinah is between them. And I love that. It is such a rich imagery. And yet, when I was at a museum in downtown Manhattan a few years ago, there was a huge photographic but moving, like a film on the wall. I don't even know what to call it, but a moving mural, and it was like an overhead projector kind of thing, and it had the quote on the wall, but it said it's as if God is between them rather than Shekhinah, which means nobody reading it would automatically think that was a female energy. Mm-hmm. And so that's just, it's not even a minor thing. I mean, to me, it's a huge thing. But all those little things that we come across in the course of our reading and our learning when we go back and study, we find, just as we do the history or the persona really of Mary Magdalene and all that was discovered with Margaret Starbird and then Dan Brown with the Da Vinci Code, but all those images and the reputation of Mary Magdalene as whore rather than as Jesus' trusted apostle and possibly wife. I mean, those are pretty big hidden truths.
Yeah.
And I know I'm using the word truth, which I always, as you know, have something of a problem with. So, but where's the line between truth and myth? And I say truth because for so many people that is a truth you don't touch. That he was not married, et cetera, and that she was something other than wife or apostle.
Right, and how many women in sacred texts were defined by their relationships with men and couldn't, and we were taught weren't powerful in their own right. They were somebody's sister or wife or mother, right. Or child or exile or hot or what's the word, pariah, right? Like outsider, like Mary Magdalene, a prostitute. So it's like no, she couldn't have been sacred to him, and or if she was, it was because he was exceptional and loved even the bad people.
Right.
And in Judaism too, like how many women weren't even named.
Lot's wife, Noah's wife. That's their
Yes,
name, right?
yes.
in the Bible.
Yeah, they're like atmosphere, in terms of extras in movies are called atmosphere.
Right.
You the atmosphere, like they're not even people. They're
Right.
just a stand-in for a two-dimensional role. And actually, I think I might have mentioned her before. Rana Dietrich has created, she tells the stories of these biblical women, named and unnamed. And she's been doing beautiful work, just like bringing all of them, bringing all of their stories, exposing and uncovering them, uncovering and exposing their stories, and bringing them out of the shadows. And I know that there are others.
Yeah, I'm just putting her name in chat because we're going to put this in our notes later on the YouTube channel. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, so those, and I think one of the reasons it felt heavy was I think there are a lot of things happening in the world right now there's information being suppressed all the time. And if it feels scary to even know that, let alone talk about it, let alone invite others to look at it, talk about it. It's not a popular opinion. And so for that to come up as kind of like the anchor of a reading, I was like, oh boy, really? Do I have to? So
big
I like,
responsibility. Yeah,
you were like, yeah, it feels like a big responsibility, right? And that was something that we wanted to talk about was, so the archetype of the prophet or prophetess,
right.
Historically, prophets aren't treated very well.
Right.
Whether they're current day truth tellers or visionaries of the future or psychics, nothing that they tell people. If there's any bad news or any uncomfortable news, they get tortured and killed for it. That's not a role that one wants to volunteer for.
Rush into, right. And I just want to say that Arthur Waskow, who's a tremendous activist in many fronts, and I think certainly marched in the streets even now in his 80s for Black Lives Matter and other issues of great import. He runs with his wife, Phyllis Berman, the Shalom Center, and they do a lot of good, not only good work, but good blogs and just very incisive things that he writes. And he has been called a modern day prophet. I just want to call out his name because people hold him in very high regard. And he is that kind of prophet of telling like it is, being a truth teller, which is never a popular position. And I guess, in ancient times, that truth telling might have dealt with what we talked about of predicting a future outcome that the king didn't like, but it doesn't have to involve telling the future.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't have to. It can be truth telling. And Deborah, you were saying before that someone asked you if you would consider yourself to be a prophet, and you said no. And I just wanted, I'll point out on the recording that one of the meanings from the root of Deborah is one who speaks. And I think that is something that you do. You speak truth in all of your teaching and in all of your leadership. And if that's part of what prophecy is, then it's clearly, I understand the discomfort with claiming the title. And I think it's good to bring some nuances.
To hold my feet to the fire. I like the way you said it before. It's also one who speaks truth from and to power.
Yes. Yeah. And there in the Netivot Oracle deck, I'll just say, like, one of the other cards that came up in my reading was the Leitzanit, the sacred fool, speak truth to power, because one of the benefits of being a sacred fool is that you can get away with it. When you speak truth to power with humor, like the court jesters, who were the only ones back in the day who could tell the king the truth because they could like hide it in silliness.
Right.
But there's and I don't remember where this comes from, but there's some phrase about modern day prophets are children and fools. So it's, oh, isn't that sweet? Or, oh, isn't that silly? Like anyone we can dismiss as and not take seriously. So there's I feel like there is there's a definite connection between the prophet and the fool. And like an undercurrent of same in those roles.
It's a great point, because especially to bring in children, because how often do we say out of the mouths of babes, because they absolutely tell it the way they see it.
Yes, they have no filter. I have a 5-year-old, I can attest to that.
Exactly.
You have to teach them, actually, people don't like it when you say that
Right.
out loud.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing. I feel like one of the things we're learning in the new paradigm is things that we were taught we should not say out loud. That's all being challenged now. When we think about last week's conversation was about ethical leadership and the kinds of things that one did not talk about in polite company. We didn't frame it that way in that conversation, but I think that that's a very important piece of what's happening in the new paradigm, is that abuse and toxicity and abuses of power, those were not things that were discussed. They were true and they were hidden. And in terms of the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter and our awareness of hate and white supremacy in so many forms, we are being encouraged and encouraging each other to tell our stories, to tell our truths, because they need to be unearthed. It's part of the healing process. And because when we model for each other that kind of vulnerability, we can heal, we can deal with the perpetrators of violence and abuse, but also we make space for others to show up in their authenticity and vulnerability, which builds community and empathy and healthy interactions, and hopefully a better world.
And sets standards, sets a bar and a definition of what a healthy relationship is, for example. And healing, as we know, doesn't come about if you don't talk about these things. And yet we didn't, like 30 years ago, we didn't really have language for it, like emotional abuse, emotional violence, verbal abuse. I don't think there was language for that 30 years ago. And yet people were certainly going through it. Yes. So I think it's really important that we now do not only have that language, but that we're shining light on through the Me Too and the Time's Up and many other movements. Yes.
She's shining her light. Yes. Yes, 100%. And often when this card comes up in a reading, when I'm reading for myself or others, I feel and I think this comes absolutely from the book and from Katsira's writing, that there's a little bit of a question in here. Do you want to know? Are you sure you want to know? Once you know, you can't unknow. Right. And so when it comes up for folks who are like, oh, do I want to talk about that? I say to them, if there's a person you feel you need to tell the truth to, make sure they're ready to hear it. Yeah. And I think in all the things that we've been discussing, we're thankfully in a time when many people are ready, and those who are not, they can self-eliminate for now.
And their healing will be slower.
Yeah, or at the pace. Yeah, and I think there's also something to be said for all of us moving and healing at the pace our nervous systems will allow. True. And that's very frustrating for those of us who are moving faster.
Mm-hmm. But it's also frustrating that often people who don't want to discuss difficult subjects, not necessarily their own personal experiences, are limiting the expansion of their consciousness.
Of their own and of the people that they don't want to hear from. But then it's up to those who are feeling maybe silenced to step away from those relationships and find spaces where their voices are welcomed. This is a very Lilith conversation.
This also brings to mind something else that came up about relationship.
Oh, yes.
Finding the sacred in intimate relationships was one of the cards.
Yes, the lover, the archetype of the lover, find the sacred in intimate relationships. Yes, and you were very excited about that one. So tell us, where do you want to take us?
I was excited about it because I think it's such a key to healthy relationships. And it's often really difficult to identify what that is. What do you mean, the sacred in intimate relationship? And if people just stop and think about what matters to them, what's important to them, how they want to be treated, I think that does make it easier then to respond with maybe more patience, compassion, empathy in a relationship. I know in my own relationship at home, I've I found over the past year, especially during the lockdown, that if I was doing something like cooking in particular out of resentment, I should stop doing it, because you want to serve food with love, so especially food, or at least good energy, and not, some kind of resentment. That's neither good for the cook nor the person who's eating the food. But you're also then feeding an energy field that you probably don't want. And so I think it's really important for people to learn how to step back. There's a principle of Tzimtzum in mystical Judaism.
Contraction.
Right.
Contraction for the sake of making space.
Right. Allowing the other to have the space they need to show up. And also moving forward to take up the amount of space you deserve and that you should have. And so that's a very interesting exercise, and to think of it that way on a daily basis, in the dailiness of your life, as a friend of mine would say, is a very practical tool, I think, to take one of the tools, I hope, that we're offered that people can take from this conversation. Because otherwise you just can end up doing this, butting heads or arguing over the same thing. And married couples or people who have lived together for years as intimate partners know very well that some arguments seem to just keep rising again and again because they never get resolved, right? So I think that's one way to help that, keep that from happening. I know we don't like to repeat arguments we may have had 10 years ago, and so I'm especially somehow conscious of that now, maybe since the lockdown. And so learning how to, finally really talk about whatever the thing is, gently, not accusing, but putting it on the table firmly and out with love. It's the only way I can say it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it takes immense bravery to do that. I mean, you're uncovering your own truth,
right.
And we are very. It comes back, even if the relationship is healthy and not toxic, right. We're very conditioned, like, don't shalom bite, like for the sake of peace in the house. You shouldn't make trouble. You shouldn't make waves. You shouldn't stir things up. You should just, make assumptions, that you should assume the goodwill of everybody involved and eat it, basically, right? When you're feeling frustrated or distressed or not seen or not heard or not held. And that's another thing that I think is really shaking up and changing. And
it's really important, because that kind of silencing of ourselves is a lot riskier than just letting yourself be vulnerable enough to have that conversation. Because if you do that, as you said, it's kind of risky, to lay yourself open. But if you can manage to push through that, you can solve the thing, or at least talk about it. And so you may agree that you're never going to agree, but you're not going to fight about it either, and to find compromises, which is also an important part in relationship.
Yes. And because you said it's less risky to tell the truth. And I think it depends what you find risky. Because it also, once the truths are on the table, you may find that this is not the right partner for you. Right. And depending on how risky that feels, I think that's, a benefit of sort of the mainstream perspective on long-term partnerships and marriage and divorce, is that nowadays, better to get divorced than to stay in a miserable relationship that's not a fit.
Right.
And I mean, like, I am a woman who's going through a divorce. So I certainly feel that way, and that lots and lots of truths come out in that process, right? Like once the cards are on the table and any piece of not fit is discovered, it seems like all the not fit pieces can come forward. Right. So if you can do that before you get to be 10 years into a relationship, as early as possible, then it's clarifying. And when everybody involved in the relationship is invested in each other's health and well-being and best, then that process can also bring you closer together, right. And can really strengthen a relationship. And for me, finding the sacred in relationships, I wanted to say, like, for me, we are all God, goddess. And I believe humans, in fact, living things, are the embodiment of the divine in the world. Yeah. And so, when I'm able to look at whoever I'm in relationship with, and I think about my daughter, it's easy to see God in her. Right. And it's harder to see God in my ex-partner, so even though I do, but it's still, I'm mad. And that's interesting too, because like, how does our emotions with humans and living things in our day-to-day life, how does that mirror our relationship with the divine and the sacred? And how also in sort of the old days, we were not allowed to be mad at God. Like there are many who would say that that's not okay. I'm grateful that I feel like in Judaism, we're allowed to be mad. We're allowed to yell at God and say, what the hell? Why is it so hard? And there's no risk. Like there's a sense of divine love and compassion, no matter what. And that also, like, what if we can somehow bring that with the understanding that even though we are all God, we do not have God's infinite patience and compassion. We are human, and that's okay.
Right. And women also, by the way, were not allowed to get angry many times.
Yeah, we've talked about this. Absolutely. And with anybody, not just God.
Right. No, with other humans. Right.
Yeah, we're not allowed to. That was an emotion that we've historically not been allowed to express. It's too threatening.
Yeah.
And we're learning to be righteous in our anger. That's also a good Lilith teaching.
And yes, it is. And another one, it's probably not a Lilith teaching, perhaps, but to be able to put some humor with the anger. So even a behavior or habit of our partners that really, really gets us crazy, to be able to point it out with laughter, which we've actually been doing lately, is wonderful, because it gets the message across without pointing a finger like that, and without the vitriol that can sometimes be on our face or in our voice or in our posture when we're angry and when it's pent up.
Yeah. I had the pleasure and honor of officiating a wedding last weekend. And one of the things that one of the partners had said about the other in an interview, and I said, what are things that you find endearing, that you love about your partner? And they said, well, they don't see dirt. Made its way into the wedding, just like that's a thing that could drive someone crazy, but that they laugh about. And I think it's such a good example. It's such a good example of like when you really get to know someone and see the best in them, then you can find the humor and you can find the playfulness and even the things that could otherwise drive you crazy.
The playfulness is a good term. Yeah, definitely.
There's that sacred fool again, right?
Yes,
like the truth through humor. Not passive aggressive humor, mind you.
Oh, yeah, right.
Through humor where we're laughing with, not at. Right. But that it's like the spoonful of sugar, that makes the medicine go down. The humor helps the truth go down.
Yeah, no, playfulness is a great way to imagine it, I think, and phrase it, because that embodies for me more than just humor. There's often it's a loving playfulness in many cases, or can be. Yeah.
I'm so glad that card came up for me in my reading, because playfulness, I feel, is not my strength in my work or in my relationships. Mm-hmm. And so I'm taking it as sort of like an angel card, like I'll get a boost of these abilities this year.
Great. That's great. Anything else you want to share from your reading?
In the offerings, like right smack in the middle card in the reading was the Na'ara, the maiden, delight in the sweetness of life. And I love this archetype, and I love this card. To me, this is about following the enthusiastic yes. If it's joyful, then do it. And that came up a bunch. In fact, the position of the lover in this reading was about pleasure and joy and delight. So I'm very happy that pleasure and joy and delight have been a feature actually of my past year. I've been very blessed to have a pandemic partner that I may not have him much longer. And for that, and to learn that I can have, playful, delightful, joyful, loving relationship. And because in Jewish tradition, we have blessing power all the time, and extra at times when we're receiving blessing, like birthdays or if we're getting married. So that means I have extra blessing power today. So I would love, so maybe I'll hold it until the end, and Devorah, if there's anything you want to add, and then I'll close with a blessing.
That sounds wonderful. Well, before we get to that, I think I would just like to give you a blessing.
Oh, thanks. I'll take it.
Well, birthday, you've got to have that. So this has been, as always, a very stimulating, wonderful conversation. And I want to bless you with continued joy and presence and vision and enthusiasm, with the continuing questioning that you do of life, and the probing you do of other people's motivations and speech. It's very much that of the truth teller. And I want to bless you with that continued ability, that capacity to see and to not be afraid to speak. And of course, good health and abundance.
Amen. Thank you.
Selah.
Selah. Thank you. I'll take all of that, and with the overflow, with that abundance, I bless all you watching, and you, Devorah, all of us. That this year our truths flow like honey from our tongues, with pleasure and ease and delight. That when we are afraid, we find our way back with humor, with the support of our embodied yeses, and with the support of communities that are rising up in collaboration and collective power. Really. May it be so. Amen.
So, amen and Selah. Thank you. And thank you for another wonderful episode.
Yes, a pleasure. Thank you so much for being here with us on Tending Lilith's Fire. If you've enjoyed this, please like the episode, share it, and subscribe so you'll find out when the next ones are coming.
All right. We bid you adieu for now.
Take care.